I gave her 10 minutes to disappear forever. No trial, no explanation. As the most powerful mafia boss in the city, my word was law. But as I watched my disabled son, the boy doctor said would never walk, take his first steps toward the woman I had just destroyed, I realized I hadn't just fired a nanny. I had thrown away a miracle. There wasn't a single creak from the lock. John Carlo Benedetti had oiled every hinge in the mansion himself the night before, moving through his own home like a man breaking into someone else's, which was ironic because there wasn't a door in all of the exclusive Todd Hill neighborhood that he couldn't open with a phone call or a bullet. He'd been planning this trap for 3 days, ever since Dolores, the 62-year-old head housekeeper who'd served the Benedetti family for 30 years, had leaned close to his ear that morning and whispered with the kind of manufactured worry he'd mistaken for loyalty. "That Reese girl does strange things with your boys when you're gone, sir. The children don't cry anymore, and that isn't normal. Babies are supposed to cry, and if they're not crying, it's because she's drugging them or scaring them into silence." Carlo, who only saw his sons in scheduled intervals, hadn't realized that their silence in his presence was a gift of peace, not a symptom of fear. Those words had been smoldering inside Carlo's chest for 3 straight nights, like a fuse that couldn't be stomped out. The fear of a widowed father is the most dangerous fuel on earth because it doesn't turn into worry. It turns into a death sentence before there's even a shred of evidence. And when that widowed father also happens to be the most powerful mafia boss on the eastern seaboard, the sentence doesn't come with a trial. So this morning he'd kissed his twin boys goodbye, climbed into the armored SUV, told Frankie, his head of security, to inform everyone that he was flying to Miami for a sit-down with an allied family, then parked 3 blocks away, and walked back through the rain with his leather briefcase in one hand. A briefcase that carried nothing but suspicion and the cold weight of a decision he'd already made. Because before he'd left the house, he'd told Frankie in a voice that allowed no argument, "If I find out she's hurting them, I want her gone before midnight. No trace." Carlo turned the doorknob so slowly that every second stretched into a full minute. Inside, the mansion drowned in the same deceptive silence he'd grown far too familiar with since Catalina's death. That suffocating quiet he'd forced into every corner with schedules, rules, and a mourning that had stretched past 16 months with no sign of ending. Ever since the car bomb meant for him had taken her instead and left him with 2 sons. He didn't know how to hold without feeling like his hands were made of broken glass. He'd fired 5 nannies in 8 months. 1 for arriving 3 minutes late. 1 for using her phone while feeding the twins. 1 simply because her laughter was too loud for a house still dressed in grief. 1 for laying Gio on his stomach without a doctor's written permission. And 1, the last one, because he'd caught her sneaking photos of his children. And in his world, photographing a boss's family without consent was the kind of mistake people didn't get to make twice. But this Reese Holloway was something else entirely. She was a riddle he couldn't crack. Too young at 27, too inexperienced, raised in foster homes with no family name and no connections, and, according to Dolores, far too common, too street, too beneath the Benedetti standard. Carlo stepped into the foyer and stopped dead, holding his breath, straining his ears against the silence. He expected crying. He expected the television blaring at full volume. He expected to find Reese asleep on the Italian leather sofa while his sons lay abandoned in their cribs. But what reached him from the living room wasn't anything he'd prepared himself to face. It wasn't crying. It wasn't television. It was laughter. Not the polite, restrained kind, but the deep, gut-wrenching, stomach-aching kind that erupts from somewhere so raw and primal. It almost sounds like screaming. The kind of laughter that shakes walls and fills lungs and hurts in the best possible way. The kind he hadn't heard inside this house since the night before Catalina died. It was Arlo and Gio, his 14-month-old twin boys, laughing as if the world outside these walls didn't exist, as if there was no empire, no enemies, no grief. Carlo stood frozen in the hallway, his knuckles white around the handle of the empty briefcase, and felt that laughter hit him like a blade twisting between his ribs. Because he, their own father, the man who controlled half of New York's underworld, had never once made them laugh like that. Because what Carlo saw when he reached the doorway of that living room was so shocking, so absurd, and so dangerously beautiful that it would change everything he believed about love, about control, and about the woman he'd already decided to destroy. Carlo took 3 more steps down the corridor, each one slower than the last, his Italian leather shoes making no sound on the oak floor, even as his heart hammered like a fist inside his chest. And when he reached the threshold of the living room, when his eyes finally found the source of that laughter, his mind needed several seconds to process what he was seeing because the scene before him was so illogical. It didn't belong to any scenario he'd ever prepared for. The living room, usually a temple of minimalist order with its cream Italian leather sofa, gold-framed abstract paintings, and the Persian rug Catalina had bought on her final trip to Istanbul before she died, now looked like the stage of a play he hadn't been invited to watch. And at the center of it all, right on the rug he guarded like a sacred relic, was her, Reese Holloway. She wasn't sitting and reading to the children. She wasn't standing in the kitchen warming milk. The 27-year-old woman with dark hair loosely tied at the nape of her neck was lying flat on her back on the floor. Her body stretched straight across the Persian rug, both arms raised into the air. And on her hands were a pair of glaring yellow rubber gloves, the kind used to scrub sinks or clean toilets, the kind of cheap gloves bought at a dollar store that should never appear in any room of the Benedetti house. But what made Carlo's mouth fall open in absolute shock wasn't the gloves. It was what was happening on her body. Arlo, his older son, the stronger of the twins, was standing upright on Reese's chest, his tiny colorful canvas shoes pressing into the blue uniform Dolores made her wear every day. His arms lifted high above his head, his face tipped back, his mouth stretched into a grin wide enough to show newly sprouted baby teeth, looking like a miniature explorer planting a flag on the peak of Everest. And then there was Gio. Carlo felt his heart skip a beat when he saw Gio. Gio, the younger twin, the more fragile one, the child Dr. Whitfield had sat across from him 3 months earlier and told him in a voice so careful it sounded almost apologetic that the boy had severe motor development issues, that he could barely stand on his own, and the family should prepare for a long road ahead. That child was here, standing on Reese Holloway's stomach, his legs trembling with effort, his knees slightly buckling but not giving way, his small hands gripping the nanny's shoulders like the only balance bar in the world, his mouth open in laughter. Not the weak smile Carlo sometimes saw when he held him, but the kind of laughter that exploded from the inside. "Hurricane warning," Reese shouted from the floor in a voice full of exaggerated drama and genuine joy. Then she rocked her body gently from side to side, just enough to create instability, mimicking a miniature earthquake beneath the children's feet. Arlo leaned with the motion, laughing uncontrollably, his arms still raised high, refusing to hold on to anything because that was part of the game, while Gio tightened his grip on her shoulders, his lips pressing together for a second in a desperate attempt to stay balanced before a high-pitched laugh burst out of him when he realized he was still standing. The sound of pure victory, the sound of a child doing something the entire world had told him he couldn't do. Reese held both boys by their ankles with those glaring yellow rubber gloves, the rubber surface creating a grip human skin couldn't replicate. Her legs stretched straight and locked beneath her, her entire body transformed into a solid foundation for the living tower trembling above her. Morning light poured through the tall glass doors facing the garden, cutting into the room at an angle, turning the fine dust stirred by the movement of the 3 bodies into millions of golden specks suspended in the air. And in that moment, if a stranger had walked in, they would have seen a picture of perfect chaos, of instinctive love with no manuals required, of 3 people trusting one another completely through flesh and laughter. But Carlo wasn't a stranger. Carlo was the Benedetti boss, and he didn't see love. Carlo looked at the scene and saw nothing but what was wrong. His eyes swept the room the way he scanned a financial report for red numbers. Fast, precise, with no room for emotion. The first thing he saw was the glaring yellow rubber gloves on Reese's hands. And instead of seeing protection, his mind cataloged every kind of bacteria, every cleaning chemical that rubber surface might have touched before it came into contact with his children's skin. He imagined detergent particles clinging to Joe's ankles, seeping through the socks, soaking into the boy's skin. And even though he knew nothing about chemistry, fear didn't need knowledge to function. Fear only needed an image, and it filled in the rest with the worst possible scenarios. The second thing he saw was the height. The children standing on Reese meant they were less than half a meter above the floor. But in Carlo's mind, that distance stretched into an abyss. He saw Gio falling headfirst onto the oak floor. He saw bruises. He saw broken bones. He saw an emergency room flooded with cold white neon light and a doctor asking him why he let such a small child fall. And he knew exactly what that feeling would be like because he'd stood in an emergency room once before 16 months ago when they wheeled Catalina in on a gurney and all he could see was blood, not his wife. The third thing he saw was the insult. Benedetti's sons, blood of a family that had ruled half the New York underworld for 4 generations, were being turned into circus performers on the living room floor by a girl with no lineage, no degrees, raised in government housing. A girl Dolores called street trash, a label he'd never challenged because deep down he believed it, believing that someone without a family couldn't possibly know how to care for someone else's. He looked at the Persian rug, the last thing Catalina ever bought, the one object in the house that still held her perfume if he knelt close enough and breathed deeply enough. And he saw Arlo's dirty shoes stepping on it, saw Reese's body rolling back and forth across it, saw it reduced to a communal exercise mat for a cheat game, and every crushed Persian thread felt like a tether to Catalina snapping. He looked at the living room worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The room he'd had decorated by the most expensive interior designer in Manhattan after his wife's funeral because he couldn't bear the sight of the old furniture, and he saw it turned into a playground. Messy, loud, and out of control. But all of that, the bacteria, the height, the insult, the rug, the room, all of it was just the surface. Beneath it, far deeper in the place Carlo never willingly looked, was what was truly tearing him apart. It was the loss of control. Since the day Catalina died, control had been the only thing keeping him upright. He controlled the empire with iron and blood. He controlled the house with schedules precise to the minute. He controlled the children with 4 layers of nannies, house staff, bodyguards, and security cameras. He controlled his own pain by locking it inside a steel box in his chest and never opening the lid. Control was Carlo's oxygen. Without it, he'd die, or worse, he'd feel. And now standing in the living room doorway, he was watching a 27-year-old stranger with no money to her name command his son's emotions in a way he never could. She made them laugh with games he didn't understand. She made them trust with the language of the body he couldn't speak. She reached something inside Arlo and Gio that he, their father, the most powerful man they'd ever know, couldn't reach, no matter how much money, how many roles, how many guards he used. And in John Carlo Benedetti's world, allowing anyone to control anything that belonged to him was a sign of weakness. And weakness killed faster than bullets. Blood rushed to his head. The businessman vanished. The boss vanished. The cold strategist who calculated every move 3 steps ahead vanished. What remained was a widowed father gripped by fear and an insulted master looking for a name to pour his rage into. He found that name on his lips before he had time to think. Reese. It wasn't a call. It wasn't a shout. It was a growl. A low, dense sound torn from the bottom of Carlo's throat. The sound he used in only one situation in his life in the underground meeting room beneath the Italian restaurant on Arthur Avenue, when he sat at the head of the table and spoke the name of a man about to be sentenced. A voice that didn't need to rise because it was heavy enough to fall like a hammer. A voice Frankie once joked made grown men forget how to breathe. One single word, a sharp, heavy syllable that rang through a living room filled with light and laughter. And the effect was exactly like someone yanking a plug from a socket and killing the entire system at once. Reese reacted first, her body locked as if shocked. Every muscle holding the children steady, tightening all at once in a reflex she didn't control. The reflex of a body that had been hit often enough to know that when a man's voice roared like that, what came next would be a fist or a hand or a belt or whatever was closest. And that reflex didn't care that she was standing in a multi-million-dollar mansion in Todd Hill instead of a 40-square-meter apartment in Queens where Troy Maddox once broke her collarbone over rice that was 10 minutes cold. Her body didn't know the difference. It only knew to curl inward and brace for impact. The children reacted right after, only half a breath slower. Arlo and Gio didn't understand what the word Reese meant in that context. But they didn't need language. They understood vibration. They understood frequency. They understood the way the air in the room shifted from warm to frozen in a fraction of a second, and both 14-month-old boys flipped from the purest happiness they've ever known into absolute panic without a single stop in between. Arlo's laughing face crumpling, then shattering. Joe's eyes squeezed shut in joy, flying open in terror, and the delicate balance the three of them had built with trust and laughter collapsed. Gio fell first, the baby standing on Reese's stomach on trembling legs. The baby, for whom standing at all was already a miracle, turned his head toward the doorway where the growl came from, and that movement alone broke the fragile center he was holding. His left foot slid off Reese's stomach. His body tipped to the right, tipping toward the hard, cold oak floor less than half a meter away. But half a meter to a 14-month-old might as well have been 10 stories. Carlo saw his son falling. A father's instinct tore through the shell of the boss. He lunged forward, his leather briefcase slipping from his hand and slamming onto the floor. But he was still 4 steps away, 5 steps, too far, too slow. His Italian leather shoes were thousands skidding on the polished wood. And he knew he wouldn't make it. He knew with the horrific certainty of a father watching his child fall while his hands still reached into empty air. But Reese didn't need to reach into empty air because she was already there. She was right beneath him. She was the ground. And in the moment, Gio tipped. In the slice of time physics allows between losing balance and impact. A slice so small Carlo hadn't even finished his second step. Reese moved. Not a thought-out move, not a trained one. It was the movement of a body that had lived long enough in danger to turn survival reflex into a native language. Her right hand released the children's ankles and shot up like a spring, catching Gio midair, her palm cradling the back of his neck, her fingers wrapping the back of his head, pulling him into her chest before his body could tilt a single centimeter closer to the floor. At the same time, her left arm wrapped around Arlo's waist, pinning him tight to her side, and in one motion so smooth it looked rehearsed 1,000 times, she rolled left, using the momentum to sit up and finish seated on the floor with both children pressed against her chest, safe, contained, protected. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, faster than Carlo could take 3 steps, faster than his growl could fade from the air, faster than any highly paid bodyguard on his payroll could have reacted. And Carlo, the man who had spent his life hiring people to protect his children, stood there in the middle of the living room, with his arms still outstretched, touching nothing, watching a 27-year-old woman with no weapon, no armor, no credentials, save his sons with cheap yellow rubber-gloved hands. Her reflexes faster than anyone he'd ever paid to do that job. But he didn't see that. Not now. Now he only saw his children almost fall, and he needed someone to blame. The boys were crying. Not the soft, needy cry for milk or arms, but the lung-ripping shriek that erupts when a child's safe world shatters without warning. The kind of cry whose every sound wave stabbed into Carlo's ears like needles. And that cry, the sound Dolores said Reese never let the children make, now flooded the room like water breaking a dam. And it wasn't caused by Reese, but by him, by his growl, by his arrival, by the rage he carried into a room full of laughter and turned into a battlefield. But Carlo didn't see that truth because a man on fire sees nothing but flames. Carlo crossed the living room in 3 long strides, each one carrying the weight of a man who wasn't used to being denied anything in his life. And when he reached Reese, sitting on the floor with both children pressed tight against her chest, he didn't stop, didn't ask, didn't explain. He bent down and yanked Arlo out of her arms with one hand, his fingers closing around the child's small body and pulling him up with enough force that Arlo jerked backward, his crying mouth cutting off for a split second in shock before exploding into a scream twice as loud. The kind of scream that shook his entire body because he didn't understand why his father was ripping him away from the only place he felt safe. In a way, no one should ever pull a 14-month-old child. Carlo held Arlo against his chest with one arm, the boy thrashing and crying into the collar of his suit, tears and mucus soaking into the collar of his suit. But Carlo didn't notice because his eyes were locked on Reese, on the other child, still in her arms. And he extended his empty hand forward, palm up. A gesture that wasn't a plea, but a command. The gesture he used when demanding that someone hand over what belonged to him without needing to say another word. Let go of my child. 3 words, low voice, no shouting. He didn't need to shout. Reese lifted her head to look up at him from the floor. Gio still buried against her chest, his tiny hands clenched in the blue fabric of her uniform like a lifeline. And in that moment, something strange happened. Something no one had dared do in front of Carlo Benedetti in 30 years. She didn't let go. Not because she wanted to challenge the boss. Not because she was brave or reckless or foolish, but because Joe's hands were gripping her shirt and Reese Holloway's instinct. The instinct forged through 27 years of being abandoned by the world and standing back up alone told her not to release a frightened child just because a man ordered it, no matter who that man was. Her eyes met Carlo's, and for the first time in a long while, someone looked at him that way. Not with a bowed head, not turned aside, not stealing a glance before looking away, but straight on, level, looking up from the floor without actually looking up, as if she were standing at his height, even while seated on the rug. And he loomed above her. 1 heartbeat passed. 2. Then Reese lowered her gaze to Gio and whispered something Carlo couldn't hear over Arlo's screams, gently prying the boy's fingers from her shirt one by one, carefully, like pulling a thread from fabric without tearing it. Then she set Gio down on the floor beside Carlo next to his brother, and the 2 children immediately turned toward each other, clinging together on the rug and crying as if they only had each other left in the world. Reese stood. She rose from the floor slowly, without rushing, without panic, her back straight. And when she was fully upright, Carlo realized she was taller than he'd thought. Or maybe she wasn't taller at all. And it was simply the way she stood that made her seem impossible to crush. The way someone stands when they've endured too much to be afraid anymore. Carlo spoke, his voice flat as the marble table in the underground meeting room. You have 10 minutes to leave this house. Minute 11 won't be pleasant. Reese didn't cry. She didn't kneel to beg. She didn't say, please give me a chance to explain. She didn't talk about medical bills. About the leaking apartment in Bushwick. About the 3 weeks she'd stayed up late teaching Gio to stand while the world said he couldn't. She said none of it because Reese Holloway had learned very young that begging powerful people only gave them more power. And she'd begged enough in her life. Begged foster families not to send her back. Begged Troy to stop hitting her. Begged the system not to forget her, and none of it had ever worked. So she'd sworn long ago that the last time she knelt before a man was already behind her. She looked Carlo straight in the eyes and said 4 words in English, her voice shaking, not with fear, but with the effort of holding back something far bigger than fear. You'll regret this. Then she turned away. She walked past Carlo without touching him, without looking at him, without looking at the children crying on the floor. Because if she did, she wouldn't be able to leave. And she knew that. She knew that if she looked at Gio one more time, her legs would betray her, and everything she'd built in 27 years to become someone who didn't kneel would collapse right there on that Persian rug. So she walked straight out of the living room, down the hallway, the glaring yellow rubber gloves still lying on the rug behind her. 2 bright stains in the minimalist room, like dropped pieces of sunlight someone had forgotten to pick up. At the front door, Frankie Napoli was standing. He'd heard everything, not out of curiosity, but because it was his job to hear everything that happened in this house. He watched Reese walk out, saw her red eyes without a single tear, saw the way she held her back straight, even as her shoulders trembled, and he felt something was wrong. Not wrong with her, but wrong with the situation, wrong with his boss. But Frankie had lived long enough in this world to know that telling the truth to an angry boss was the fastest way to dig his own grave. So, he said nothing to Carlo. He simply opened the door for Reese, stepped outside with her, took out his phone to call a black town car, and while they waited, he spoke quietly, his voice low and quick, like a man who didn't want anyone else to hear. "Don't walk in this neighborhood." That was all. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a practical statement from a man who knew Todd Hill wasn't a safe place for a penniless young woman to walk alone. It was the only act of kindness Reese Holloway received from the Benedetti house that day. The town car arrived. Reese got in, the door closed, and the house swallowed the sound of 2 children crying that no one there was capable of soothing anymore. The sound of the front door closing wasn't loud, but in a house drowning in crying, it rang out like the lid of a coffin being shut. A final sound announcing that something had just ended and wouldn't return. Carlo stood in the middle of the living room with Arlo in his left arm, and he looked down at the floor where Gio lay curled beside the yellow rubber gloves Reese had left behind. The baby's mouth stretched wide as he screamed at the ceiling with a sound Carlo had never heard from his son before. Not the cry for milk in the middle of the night. Not the irritated wail of a wet diaper, but the cry of loss. The kind of cry a 14-month-old child shouldn't know how to make. And yet somehow Gio did. As if inside that tiny body that couldn't speak yet, there lived a part of a soul that understood the person who helped him stand every day. The person who held him when he fell. The person who whispered that he could do it had just walked out that door and wasn't coming back. Carlo bent down and lifted Gio with his other arm. And now he stood there holding both sons, one in each arm, both screaming into either side of his neck, tears and mucus soaking into the collar of his suit. And he began to walk. He paced the living room, past the Italian leather sofa, past the Persian rug with the yellow gloves lying abandoned, past the tall windows where morning light still poured in as if nothing had happened. He walked in circles like a caged animal that couldn't find an exit. His arms rocking the children with each step, but the motion was too stiff, too fast, too mechanical, like the movement of someone reading instructions instead of someone born to soothe. He tried to sing. He opened his mouth and tried to remember the lullaby Catalina used to sing to them, something in Italian her mother had taught her. But he could only recall the melody and not the words. And when his voice came out, it was dry and rough like sandpaper scraping wood. It wasn't soft. It wasn't warm. It held none of what a frightened child needed to hear. It was just more noise added to noise. And the children cried harder. Carlo tried everything he knew. He tried laying them in the crib. They screamed. He tried turning on classical music through the house sound system, the kind he'd read somewhere was good for infants. They screamed. He tried giving them bottles, but his hands fumbled the formula. He'd never made it himself because someone else always did. And when he offered the bottle to Arlo, the boy shoved it away. Milk spilled down Carlo's suit, and Arlo screamed even louder as if the bottle itself were an insult. Nothing worked. And Carlo, the man who ran an empire where every problem had a solution, every enemy could be eliminated, every risk calculated in advance, stood in the middle of his own living room with 2 wailing children in his arms and didn't know what to do. And for the first time since Catalina died, he felt helplessness, not as an abstract idea, but as a hand closing around his throat. He had money. He had power. He had men who would die for him. But right now, to the 2 people who mattered most, he was nothing but the monster who had chased away their safety. Dolores appeared in the doorway. She entered with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks. Her face was carefully arranged into an image of concern, brows knit, lips pressed, hands folded at her stomach, looking exactly like a grandmother pained by the sound of her grandchildren crying. But if Carlo had been in a clearer state, if his nerves weren't being chewed raw by the screaming, he would have noticed that Dolores came in from the kitchen corridor rather than from her room upstairs, meaning she'd been nearby the entire time he drove. She had ignored his orders to vacate the main floor, lurking in the shadows of the service corridor like a spider waiting for its web to vibrate. Reese was out. She'd heard everything, and she'd waited long enough for the crying to reach its peak before appearing, because that crying was the proof she needed. "Poor babies," Dolores said in a voice so sweet it left a metallic taste behind, her hands reaching out as if to take Gio. But Carlo turned away on instinct. He didn't want anyone touching his children right now, not even the housekeeper he trusted most. That girl must have scared them so much they can't stand her absence. "I told you so. A street girl like that doesn't know the first thing about raising decent children." Carlo nodded. He nodded because he was exhausted and the crying was tearing him apart, and he needed someone to tell him he'd been right, that throwing Reese out was the correct decision, that this crying would pass, that the children would forget her. But the moment he nodded, something tiny pressed against his chest, no bigger than a grain of sand, yet sharp enough to cut deep. It wasn't doubt about Reese. It was doubt about Dolores. He didn't know why. He couldn't name it, but something in the way Dolores entered the room at just the right moment, in the way she said, "I told you so." Too quickly, too easily, too satisfied despite the careful mask. Something in the way her eyes flicked toward the yellow rubber gloves on the floor with a look Carlo couldn't read, but his gut could. And his gut told him that look wasn't concern. It was victory. It happened 15 minutes after Dolores left the living room. After she muttered a few more lines about street girls and disappeared into the kitchen with the light, satisfied steps of someone who had completed a job, while Carlo still stood in the middle of the room with both children in his arms, exhausted to the point his arms began to shake. Not from emotion, but from the simple physical limit of a 38-year-old man whose muscles were trained to hold guns and sign contracts rather than carry children. Finally reaching their breaking point after nearly 20 minutes under constant strain, he lowered both boys to the floor. Arlo curling on the left, Gio on the right, both still crying. But the sound had shifted from screaming into something worse. A low, relentless keening, steady and hopeless. The cry of someone who had run out of tears while the pain remained. The kind of cry Carlo realized he had heard once before from his own mouth. Locked in the bathroom 3 days after Catalina's funeral, sitting on cold tile and making that exact sound, no longer crying, but groaning with loss. He sat down on the sofa, bent forward, both hands covering his face, and allowed himself to close his eyes for 3 seconds because he couldn't watch his children hurt for 1 more second without feeling his chest split open. It was during those 3 seconds that it happened. A small sound, far smaller than the crying, so small it was almost swallowed by the keening. But Carlo heard it because a mafia boss's brain is trained to pick abnormal sounds out of noise. It was how he had survived 3 assassination attempts. The sound was wood shifting softly, oak flooring creaking under a very small weight. Carlo opened his eyes and what he saw caused everything inside his head to stop. Every thought, every judgment, every trace of anger and fear freezing at once, as if someone had unplugged his mind. Gio was no longer on the floor. The 14-month-old child had somehow rolled himself to the edge of the Italian leather sofa. The sofa Catalina had chosen, the sofa Carlo had almost thrown out after the funeral and kept only because it still carried the indentation where his wife used to sit, and Joe's tiny hands were gripping the leather cushion, fingers white with effort. As he pulled himself upward, Carlos stopped breathing. He watched Joe's legs. The legs Dr. Whitfield had said suffered from severe muscle tone weakness. The legs Carlo had listened about in a clinic 3 months earlier. While the doctor explained in technical terms he didn't understand, and then reduced it to one sentence, that it would be very difficult for the boy to stand and walk. Those legs were straightening, pushing, bearing the weight of the child's entire body, and Gio was standing up. No one helped. No one held him. There was no Reese beneath him. No yellow rubber gloves gripping his ankles. No hurricane warning to make him laugh and forget he was doing the impossible. There was only Gio alone, holding on to the edge of his mother's sofa, standing. His legs trembled, his knees buckled once and then locked. He stood upright. Carlo covered his mouth because he didn't believe what he was seeing, and he was afraid that if he made a sound, the miracle would vanish. Then Gio released one hand from the sofa, then the other. He stood there for 1 second, 2 seconds, swaying lightly like a young tree in the wind, but not falling, and then he stepped. The first step was so small, it was almost just a shift of balance, his right foot lifting barely an inch from the floor before settling forward. But it was a step, a real step, his foot touching the oak and holding firm. Carlo felt something break inside his chest. Not breaking in pain, but breaking like a dam that had held water too long, finally cracking. The second step, the left foot lifted, this time higher, a little more confident, and came down beside the right. Gio wobbled, but didn't fall. The third step. And by the third step, Carlo realized where his son was walking. Not toward him, not toward Dolores in the kitchen, not toward any toy or bottle. Gio was walking toward the door. The living room door leading to the hallway leading to the front door. The door Reese Holloway had walked through 15 minutes earlier and hadn't returned. Joe's mouth moved. It wasn't crying anymore. It was a word. A sound forced out of a mouth that didn't yet know sentences. His tongue striking the roof of his mouth to form a warped R that stretched into a trembling E. Re. He called Re. Each step was a call. Each call was a step. As if that name were the fuel keeping his fragile legs moving. As if he were following the echo of the person who taught him to walk. The person who lay on the floor every day so he could practice standing on her stomach. The person who turned sheet yellow rubber gloves into therapy tools and laughter into medicine. Arlo saw his brother walking. He stopped crying, eyes widening in shock for a second before twin instinct took over. He rolled upright and ran after Gio on his stronger legs. But he didn't run to his brother. He ran to Carlo, grabbed 2 of Carlo's fingers with his small hand and pulled, pulling him toward the door. And Arlo shouted, not crying now, but calling Re, as if ordering his father to stand up, to open the door, to bring her back. And Carlo looked at Arlo, tugging his hand, and then at Gio, staggering step by step toward the closed door. And his knees gave way. He didn't choose to kneel. His knees simply refused to hold him any longer. He knelt on the oak floor of his living room, watching the son the world said would never walk, walking toward the door where the woman he had just driven out had disappeared. And in that moment, between the warped Re spilling from a tiny mouth and the trembling footsteps on wood, Carlo Benedetti understood. He understood that what he had seen in the living room 30 minutes earlier wasn't a circus. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't loss of control. It was a miracle. A miracle patiently built day by a 27-year-old woman with no degrees, no family, no money, using yellow rubber gloves, laughter, and persistence that he, with all the money and power in the world, couldn't buy, and he had shattered it. He had thrown the miracle out of his house with 10 minutes and a threat. The yellow rubber gloves still lay on the Persian rug behind him, 2 bright stains against the dark weave, and now they no longer looked like cheap trash. They looked like evidence of a love he had been too blind to see. Carlo didn't remember when he stood up. Didn't remember when he placed the children into the crib. Didn't remember when he walked down the hallway toward the basement. He only knew that when he opened the steel door to the security room, Frankie was already there, seated before the 16-channel wall of monitors, back straight, arms crossed, as if he'd known Carlo would come here before Carlo himself knew. Because Frankie Napoli had worked for the Benedetti family long enough to understand that when the boss fell silent after anger, the boss was beginning to doubt himself. And when the boss doubted himself, this was where he came. The one room where truth couldn't be bent by anyone's whisper. "Rewind 3 weeks," Carlo said, his voice low and worn. No longer the growl of a boss, but the rasp of a man just knocked down by his own hand. Living room, everything. Frankie didn't ask why. He turned to the keyboard, typed a few commands, and the 16 screens flickered before snapping back to a timestamp 21 days earlier. The first day Reese Holloway set foot in the Benedetti house. Camera 3, the living room corner, had the clearest view. Carlo pulled a chair and sat, eyes locked on the screen, and what he watched over the next 45 minutes dismantled everything he'd believed for 3 weeks and rebuilt it from the rubble with something he hadn't expected, the truth. The first day, Reese sat on the living room floor with Gio in her lap, the baby crying. She laid him on his back on the rug and gently held his feet, bending his knees up and down slowly, like yoga for a tiny body. Her mouth talking to him constantly even though he didn't understand a word, saying, "Your legs are strong. You just don't know it yet. I'll show you." Then she lay back, placed Gio standing on her stomach, her hands in yellow rubber gloves holding his ankles, and he fell immediately. Tipping left, she caught him and reset him. Tipping right, she caught him and reset him. Tipping forward, she caught him and reset him. And Carlo counted on the screen. The baby fell 17 times in the first 10 minutes. 17 falls, and 17 times Reese lifted him back up without a single sign of impatience, without a single sigh, without ever setting him down and walking away. Every time he fell, she said, "It's okay. Let's try again," in a voice Carlo had to lean closer to the speaker to hear. And that voice never changed from the first time to the 17th. The same patience, the same gentleness, as if she could do this 17,000 more times without tiring. Frankie fast-forwarded to day 8. The second week, Gio stood on Reese's stomach, and this time he didn't fall right away. 3 seconds, his legs shook, but held. And on the screen, Carlo saw Reese's face from the overhead camera, saw her eyes widen, saw her lips pressed tight, holding something back, and he realized she was trying not to cry from joy over just 3 seconds. He fell on the 4th second. She caught him. Reset. Next time, 5 seconds. The next 7. Day 10. 10 seconds. Every added second was a battle this girl won with her bare hands, while the medical world had already written Gio off. And Carlo understood then. He understood why she wore the rubber gloves. The rubber created more friction than skin. It held the baby's ankles securely without squeezing hard, gave him stability without pain. That wasn't something an uneducated girl thought up at random. It was technique. It was knowledge. Something learned somewhere and applied with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. A $1.99 pair of gloves doing what Carlo's millions couldn't do. Frankie jumped to week 3. For days before today, Gio stood on Reese's stomach, and this time he didn't just stand. He lifted his right foot barely a centimeter off her stomach and placed it forward. Half a step, the first half step on the screen, Reese couldn't hold it anymore. Tears streamed down her face. She stayed flat holding his ankles, but her shoulders shook. Her chest rose and fell, and she cried without sound. The kind of crying where tears fall but no noise comes out because she was afraid the sound would distract him. She sacrificed even the right to cry aloud so he could finish that half step. And Arlo sat nearby clapping and shouting, "Yay!" And Gio laughed, and the half step was everything because it was everything. Carlos sat in the security room and didn't know when his eyes began to burn. But he knew he was watching something money couldn't buy, power couldn't command, and control couldn't create. He was watching the purest love he'd seen since Catalina was alive, and it came from someone he dismissed as trash. Frankie stayed silent for a moment, then said, "There's one more clip you should see. Not the living room, the kitchen. 2 a.m. He switched to the kitchen camera, rewound to 2:17 a.m., 10 days earlier. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the small counter light, and Reese sat alone on a stool by the island, hunched, phone to her ear, crying, not the restrained daytime kind. The 2 a.m. kind when no one is watching. The kind that involved her whole body, shoulders shaking, hand over her mouth, her voice carrying through the thin camera mic just clearly enough for Carlo to hear every word. "B, listen to me. Hang on. I know you're in pain. I know you're tired, but I'm trying. I'll make enough money. I promise. I promise you." Silence as she listened. Then her voice broke into pieces. "No, don't worry about me. I'm fine. This place is good. The babies are sweet. I won't make you wait anymore." She hung up. She sat another minute, face in her hands, shoulders still shaking, then jolted upright at the sound of Gio crying through the baby monitor on the counter. And Carlo watched Reese Holloway wipe her tears with the back of her hand, stand, take milk from the fridge, prepare a bottle for Gio with hands still trembling from crying, and walk upstairs at 2:23 a.m. to feed his son while he, their father, slept in the master bedroom, 10 steps away without knowing his child was crying. Carlo shut off the screens. The security room fell into darkness except for the blinking system lights. He sat there in silence for a long time. Then he spoke, not to Frankie, but to himself, to the empty room, to Catalina if she could still hear him somewhere. "What have I done?" Frankie didn't let Carlo sink into the darkness for long. He knew the boss needed to see more. Not because Frankie wanted to torture him, but because some wounds only heal after all the infection is cut out, and the infection in this house wasn't Reese Holloway, but what Frankie was about to show him. "Boss," Frankie said, his voice flat and careful like a man placing a bomb on the table and wanting the recipient to understand the blast before lifting the lid. "I need you to see one more thing. It's not about the nanny. It's about Dolores." Carlo lifted his head in the dark. The name dropped into the room like a stone thrown into still water, and the tiny fragment of doubt that had pressed against his chest when Dolores entered the living room earlier, the fragment he couldn't name, began to swell. "Open it," Carlo said. Frankie brought the screens back up, switching to the second-floor hallway camera and the kitchen camera. Rewinding to 9 days earlier, 3 in the afternoon, when Carlo was in a meeting downtown and Reese was putting the children down for their nap, the second-floor hallway. Dolores emerged from her room at the end of the hall, looking left and right with a look Carlo had seen thousands of times in his life, the look of someone about to do something they knew was wrong, and she moved down the hallway with quick steps, completely unlike the slow, measured pace she used when she knew she was being watched. She stopped in front of a door. Carlo recognized it instantly, and his body went rigid in the chair. The master bedroom, his room, the room where, since Catalina died, he'd kept one corner of his wife's vanity intact. With the small rosewood jewelry box locked with a key only he possessed, or at least he thought only he possessed. Dolores pulled a small brass key from her apron pocket, a spare key. Carlo didn't know it existed. She opened the jewelry box, and on the high-resolution camera, Carlo watched Dolores's 62-year-old hands lift each item in turn. The diamond necklace Carlo had given Catalina on her last birthday. The pearl earrings Catalina's mother passed down on her wedding day. The sapphire ring Catalina wore on her ring finger when she said, "I do," in the small church in Little Italy. One by one, Dolores removed them from the box and slipped them into her coat pocket with the ease of someone who'd done this before, not rushed, not trembling, not hesitant, taking the possessions of the dead as if they were her own. Carlo felt something ignite in his gut, slow and hot. Not the explosive rage of when he'd roared Reese's name, but the far more dangerous simmering anger he used when ordering traitors dealt with, the kind of anger that didn't shout but whispered, didn't slam fists, but tapped fingers. Frankie fast-forwarded to the side gate camera. The same day, 4 in the afternoon, Dolores exited through the rear service gate, the narrow path leading to the alley Carlo reserved for trash and deliveries. And there a man waited, wearing a black jacket, a baseball cap pulled low to hide half his face, and Dolores handed him a small cloth bag and received an envelope in return. The exchange taking less than 30 seconds like a routine, repeated so many times, it no longer required words. "I ran facial recognition," Frankie said, his voice emotionless, though Carlo could hear the restraint in the way his fingers tapped the desk. "No match in our database, but I traced the license plate of the car he parked at the end of the alley." Frankie paused, and Carlo knew he wasn't pausing for lack of information, but weighing how to deliver what came next without the boss flipping the table. "That car is registered to a shell company in Brighton Beach." Brighton Beach. The words hit Carlo like bullets. Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, the heart of the Russian community in New York, primary territory of Yuri Petrov, the Russian mafia boss Carlo had sworn to bury alive since the day Petrov planted a bomb under his Mercedes 16 months ago. The bomb Catalina took instead of him because that morning her car ran out of gas and she took his keys to go to the store. Frankie wasn't finished. He opened a file, a list of outgoing calls from Dolores's phone he'd quietly extracted from the house network monitoring system. She called 3 different numbers, all flagged by the NSA as linked to the Petrov organization. Frequency 2 to 3 times a week, starting 4 months ago. For months. Dolores had been selling him to Petrov for 4 months. Carlo calculated 4 months ago was when he began expanding operations into the New York port area, territory Petrov was eyeing. And now he understood why Petrov knew every move in advance. Why 2 shipments were intercepted. Why a secret meeting with an allied family in Philadelphia leaked. All because a 62-year-old housekeeper in his kitchen made tea with hands that sold his schedule. The security layout of the house where his children slept every night. His comings and goings, the names and shifts of every guard, all packaged into 3-minute phone calls in the afternoon when she thought no one noticed. But Dolores didn't know that there wasn't a corner of a mafia boss's house cameras didn't reach. Carlo stared at the dark screens, at his own faint reflection in the black glass, and realized his face had changed in the past hour. Older, more worn, and his hands were shaking, not from fear of Petrov, because Carlo Benedetti feared no one, but from rage at himself, for trusting Dolores for 30 years, because she carried Catalina over the threshold on their wedding day, because she rocked the babies to sleep when they were born, because he handed her the key to his trust, and she handed the key to his house to the man who killed his wife. And he, the mafia boss who trusted no one, trusted her blindly simply because she was old and had been there the longest, as if time were proof of loyalty, when in truth, time was only proof of patience, waiting for betrayal. Carlo left the security room and went straight up to the first floor into his study, the dark walnut-paneled room with the heavy mahogany desk his father left behind. The room where every conversation carried the weight of life and death, because this was where he signed orders, where he judged, where he sentenced. And no one had ever been invited into this room and left unchanged. He sat down and placed a brown envelope Frankie had prepared on the desk. Inside it, 12 glossy photographs printed from the security cameras, sharp and unmistakable frame by frame. And he called Frankie in and said 2 words, "Call her up." 3 minutes later, Dolores walked into the study. And Carlo watched her with new eyes scrubbed clean by surveillance footage, and he saw what he had ignored for years. The way she swept the room before looking at him as if checking who was present, the way she adjusted her apron with hands that trembled not from age, but from calculation, The way she smiled with the expression he had read as warmth for 3 decades, but now saw as hollow as an emptied room. "You called for me?" Dolores asked in that familiar, sweet voice. The same voice she used to soothe the children. To whisper rumors about Reese, to say, "I told you so," in the living room earlier. One voice for every purpose. And now it made Carlo feel sick. "Sit down, Dolores," Carlo said, his voice slow. Lower than when he growled Reese's name. Lower than when he ordered men handled. Because in his world, everyone knew that when the boss shouted, he was angry and anger could fade. But when the boss lowered his voice, he was long past anger. And what remained wasn't emotion, but decision. And John Carlo Benedetti's decisions never changed. Dolores sat opposite the desk, back straight, hands on her lap, still composed. But Carlo saw her eyes flick to the brown envelope and away too fast, the glance of someone recognizing danger and pretending not to see it. Carlo said nothing. He opened the envelope and laid the 12 photographs out in front of her one by one, slowly, like dealing cards. He didn't need to explain because each image was a mirror. The first showed her opening the jewelry box with a spare key. The second showed her lifting Catalina's diamond necklace. The third showed her slipping the pearl earrings into her coat pocket. The fourth showed her handing a cloth bag to a stranger at the service gate. The fifth, sixth, and seventh showed the same act on different days, the same gate, the same man or another, but always the same car registered in Brighton Beach. The 8th through 12th were screenshots of call logs. Numbers linked to the Petrov network circled in red. 2 to 3 calls a week over 4 months. Dolores saw the final image and collapsed, not slowly but instantly. Her face shattering in a second, eyes wide, mouth open, blood draining from her skin until it turned gray, sliding from the chair to her knees on the walnut floor, hands clasped in prayer as she begged, "Carlo, please listen to me. I had no choice. Do you know how little you paid me? 30 years in this house, and my wages weren't even a tenth of that necklace. Do you know what loneliness is? Do you know what it's like to see a lifetime of wealth every day and never touch it? I'm old. I have no family, no pension, nothing but this house. And you never once asked if I was all right. Not once in 30 years, she cried, tears tracing the grooves in her face. And an hour earlier, Carlo might have softened, might have seen a poor old woman cornered by life. But that man died in the security room. The man sitting here had watched Reese Holloway cry at 2 in the morning, promising her sister she would earn enough while possessing none of the security Dolores enjoyed simply by living here. And she stole nothing, sold no one, betrayed no one. Carlo let Dolores finish. He tapped his fingers on the desk slow and steady, and when her pleas dissolved into ragged breathing, he said one sentence so quietly she had to stop breathing to hear it. You carried Catalina into this house on her wedding day. You sat her on the living room sofa and told me you would treat her like a daughter, and you sold me to the man who killed her. Dolores opened her mouth, but no sound came. Carlo stood, buttoned his vest, and delivered the sentence in a flat voice like reading a contract. You have 5 minutes to leave this house. You take nothing but the clothes you're wearing. You contact no one who has ever worked for my family. You speak my name, my children's names, or Catalina's name in any form to anyone, and Frankie will visit you, and that visit won't involve conversation. He nodded to the door. 2 guards entered and took her by the arms, and as they lifted her, as her shaking legs carried her toward the exit, she changed. Fear vanished, and something uglier replaced it. Pure hatred, and she screamed back in a shrill voice stripped of sweetness. That street girl is who you should have thrown out. She will destroy your family. You'll see. You'll see. Her screams echoed down the hallway as she was escorted out, and Carlo heard every word, but didn't turn. He stood with his back to the door, staring out the study window at the garden where Catalina once planted roses. And he understood that, even stripped of every mask, Dolores never acknowledged her own guilt. She still aimed at Reese, the girl she had used as a shield for 3 weeks to hide her own betrayal. The front door closed behind Dolores and her screaming faded along the stone path leading to the gate. But Carlo didn't hear silence return because inside his head another voice was shouting louder than any curse she'd hurled. A voice repeating a simple truth. It took him all afternoon to understand. Reese was out there alone, unprotected. He pulled out his phone and called Frankie, the call lasting less than 90 seconds. But in those 90 seconds, he issued enough orders to turn the house into a fortress, changing every front and rear gate code, resetting all camera system passwords, doubling the bodyguard schedule to full 24/7 coverage, sweeping every electronic device in the house for anything Dolores might have planted, and locking her out of all systems immediately. Frankie took the orders without a single question because he was the kind of man who understood that when the boss spoke that fast, it wasn't time to ask. It was time to move. But when Carlo ended the call and stood alone in the study, staring at the 12 photographs still spread across the desk, he realized no security system, no code, no camera, no guard, no wall could solve the real problem eating him from the inside. The problem was that Dolores had been feeding information to Petrov for 4 months. And for those 4 months, Reese Holloway had lived in this house, eaten in this kitchen, slept in the second-floor nanny room. And anyone in Petrov's network would know that. They knew her face. They knew her name. They knew what time she left every Sunday to visit her sister at the hospital. And now she wasn't in the house anymore. She was somewhere out there in a city of 10 million people with an old phone and not a dollar to her name because Carlo hadn't even paid her final month. And she knew nothing. She didn't know the man she worked for was a mafia boss. She didn't know a Russian crime organization had eyes on everyone coming and going from this house. She didn't know that in Petrov's world, anyone who left the Benedetti circle was a weak link to be pressured, lured, threatened, interrogated for information. And Petrov wouldn't care that Reese truly knew nothing. Because in the underworld, no one believed a person could live in a boss's house and know nothing. That was as absurd as claiming a fish lived in water without getting wet. Carlo stood in the middle of his study and felt a new kind of fear. Not the familiar fear of a boss watching enemies, but the fear of a man who's just realized he'd pushed an innocent woman into the line of fire and shut the door behind her. He lifted the phone and called Frankie again. "Prepare the car. I'm going to find her." Silence on the other end. The kind of silence Carlo knew meant Frankie was choosing his words carefully because he wanted to object without getting fired. "Boss, let me go or let me send 2 men with you. Petrov might be watching the house. If you go out alone right now." "No." Carlo cut him off. "No bodyguards, no armor, no armored car. I'm driving myself." "Boss, I..." Threw her out. "Frankie, I looked her in the eye and told her my 11 wouldn't be pleasant. I pushed a 27-year-old woman with no weapon, no money, no connections onto the street while Petrov was circling the gate. So, I'll go find her myself, alone, the way she walked out of this house alone." Frankie didn't argue further. Carlo heard a quiet exhale on the line, the breath of a man who knew he'd lost the argument before it began. Then the sound of hurried footsteps and keys. Carlo left the study, walked down the hallway, paused for a second outside the nursery where Arlo and Gio had finally fallen asleep after crying themselves empty. The 2 boys curled together in one crib, though there were 2, as if they needed each other, because no adult in this house felt safe to cling to. He looked at his sleeping sons and made a silent vow that he would bring Reese back. Not because he needed a nanny, not because the children needed her, though both were true, but because it was the only right thing left he could do after a day of nothing but wrong choices. He took the keys to the black Maserati in the garage. The car he never drove himself because there was always a driver. And when he slid into the seat, when he turned the key and heard the engine roar inside the enclosed underground space, he realized it was the first time in over 5 years he'd gone out alone. No guards ahead, no escort behind, Nothing between him and the outside world except the windshield and a thin layer of paint. And it was also the first time in many years he was doing something not for power, not for territory, not for money or family honor, but for something simpler and heavier than all of that combined. Guilt. The Maserati rolled out of the Todd Hill estate into the rain-soaked night, and the Benedetti boss drove alone toward Brooklyn, following the only address in the personnel file of the nanny whose life he had just shattered. Rain poured over Brooklyn as if someone had turned on a faucet in the sky and forgotten to shut it off. That kind of New York autumn night rain, where water doesn't fall in drops, but in sheets. And Carlo drove the Maserati through streets that grew darker as he left Manhattan, crossed the Verrazzano Bridge, then cut through Brooklyn, guided by GPS, into a neighborhood he had never set foot in. Despite it being less than 40 minutes from his Todd Hill estate, because those 40 minutes were the distance between two completely different planets. Halfway to the destination, the car's Bluetooth system cut through the sound of the rain. It was Frankie. Code red, Voss. The two words that stripped away any illusion of a simple retrieval mission. I just picked up chatter on the encrypted channels. Petrov has issued a collection order. Carlo tightened his grip on the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. A collection order wasn't a hit. A hit was quick. A hit was a bullet in the head. A collection order meant they wanted her alive. It meant interrogation. It meant they believed she held the keys to the Benedetti kingdom, and they intended to peel the information out of her layer by layer. They think she knows the codes, Frankie said, his voice tight. They think she's a mole we planted, or a lover you trusted. They don't know she was just the nanny. Carlo didn't answer. He slammed his foot onto the accelerator, the Maserati's engine screaming as he wove through the heavy traffic, running a red light, then another. He wasn't driving to apologize anymore. He was driving to stop a massacre. When he turned onto the Bushwick street the GPS indicated, he almost thought he'd made a mistake because nothing on this block resembled anything he was used to seeing. Shops were shuttered early with metal grates pulled down. Graffiti climbed the walls from sidewalk to second floor. Trash bins spilled onto the curb. Streetlights flickered sickly yellow, and some stretches had no light at all. And Carlo parked at the curb and sat in the car for a long moment, trying to process the reality that the girl he had just expelled from a $15 million mansion in Todd Hill lived here in this place on the street. And that she walked these streets every Sunday when her day off ended. And she returned to his house to care for his children, while he had never once asked where she lived. Not a single time. Because he didn't care. Because she was just the sixth nanny, and he had grown used to treating nannies as replaceable parts instead of human beings. He stepped out of the car, and the rain hit his face immediately, soaking his hair and seeping through his suit within 10 seconds, and he walked to the building number listed in her personnel file. A 5-story brown brick walk-up with a rusted fire escape zigzagging down the exterior. No proper lobby door, just a glass door cracked at one corner and patched with clear tape. And he pushed inside as damp air slammed into him like an invisible wall. The smell of peeling old paint, aging pipes, hallway carpet soaked too many times to ever fully dry. And he looked at the staircase ahead. No elevator, 5 flights on foot, concrete steps worn hollow in the center by decades of use, an iron handrail that wobbled under his grip. Carlo climbed floor by floor, his Italian leather shoes stepping on rain-slicked stairs where water blew in through hall windows with no glass. And by the time he reached the 5th floor, his breathing was heavy, not from weakness, but because each level stripped away another layer of understanding about Reese Holloway's life. The 1st floor with trash piled in the stairwell corner. The 2nd with barking dogs and a baby crying through thin doors. The 3rd reeking of cheap cigarettes. The 4th plunged into darkness by a broken hallway bulb forcing him to feel his way. And the 5th, the top floor, with 2 doors facing each other. He stopped at the door on the right. Number 52. Carlo knocked on the chipped paint of door number 52. Silence answered him, not the silence of an empty room, but the held breath of someone standing just on the other side, terrified to move. He knocked again, softer this time, realizing that his fist sounded like a threat in this hollow hallway. "Reese," he said, his voice rough from the rain and the drive. "It's Carlo Benedetti. Open the door." There was a long pause, then the sound of a heavy deadbolt sliding back, followed by the scrape of a chair being pulled away from the handle. The door opened a crack, kept in place by a rusted chain, and one swollen, red-rimmed eye peered out at him. She saw his face, saw the water dripping from his expensive suit, and for a second, he thought she would slam the door. But she didn't. She undid the chain with trembling fingers and pulled the door wide, stepping back to let him in as if surrendering to an execution squad. Carlo stepped over the threshold, and the smell hit him instantly, a mix of old damp plaster, cheap bleach, and sickness. He looked around the single room and felt the air leave his lungs. There was no furniture, only a mattress shoved into the corner with a thin gray blanket. In the center of the room, 3 plastic buckets sat on the bare concrete floor, catching steady drips of brown water from the ceiling, the rhythmic plink-plink-plink the only sound in the apartment. But it was the wall opposite the bed that stopped him cold. It was covered in a chaotic mosaic of paper, bills tacked up in rows, hundreds of them. Carlo stepped closer, his Italian leather shoes squelching on the damp floor, and read the headers. St. Jude's Medical Center. Dialysis treatment. Kidney function tests. Past due. Final notice. Collection agency. The numbers blurred together, hundreds, thousands, totaling over $200,000. And in the center of the collage of debt was a photo of a young girl in a hospital bed, smiling with tubes in her nose, looking exactly like Reese. Reese stood by the window, her back pressed against the peeling paint, her hands clutching the sleeves of her oversized hoodie. She wasn't looking at him with anger anymore. She was looking at him with the terrifying clarity of a prey animal that knows it has been cornered. "I didn't tell anyone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know who you are. I know what you do. I didn't say a word about the house or the children or your schedule. I just left." Carlo turned to look at her, confused for a split second before the horror washed over him. She thought he was here to clean up a loose end. She thought the Mafia boss had climbed 5 flights of stairs to silence the nanny who knew too much. And looking at himself, the soaked suit, the dark eyes, the unexpected arrival at night, he realized he had given her every reason to believe it. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, but the words sounded hollow in the empty room. "I came because..." He stopped. How could he explain? How could he explain that he was the monster who had fired her in the morning and the penitent who had driven through a storm to find her at night? He looked down at her feet. She was barefoot on the wet concrete. Then he looked at his own shoes, worth more than everything in this apartment combined. The disparity was a physical weight, crushing him. He remembered calling her street trash. He remembered the way she had protected his son from falling while he stood frozen. He remembered the yellow gloves she bought for $1.99 because she couldn't afford anything else, gloves that had done more for his son than his millions. The guilt didn't just hit him, it brought him down. Carlo Benedetti, the man who made mayors tremble and rivals bleed, bent his knees. He sank down until his expensive suit trousers soaked up the dirty water on the concrete floor. He knelt before the 27-year-old girl in the donated hoodie, lowering his head not in defeat, but in absolute submission to the truth she represented. Reese stared at him, her mouth parting in shock. She pressed herself harder against the wall as if the sight of a king kneeling was more frightening than his rage. "Reese," he said, looking up at her from the floor, his voice stripping away the boss, the Don, the legend, leaving only the father. "I was wrong. I watched the tapes. I saw everything. I saw the gloves. I saw the 17 falls. I saw you crying in the kitchen at 2 in the morning." He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat tasting like iron. "But that isn't why I'm kneeling. I'm kneeling because after you left, after I threw you out, Gio walked. Reese stopped breathing. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening until they were all white and dark iris. He pulled himself up on the sofa. Carlo continued, tears mixing with the rain on his face. He stood up, and he walked 3 steps toward the door. He was looking for you. He called your name. He called for Ree. A sound tore out of Reese's throat, a sob so violent it bent her double. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, mirroring him, her face buried in her hands. She didn't cry because she was happy. She cried because she had missed it. The moment she had worked for, prayed for, starved for, the moment she had bought those yellow gloves for, had happened when she was gone. She had saved his son, and in return, the father had robbed her of the victory. I missed it, she choked out, rocking back and forth on the wet floor. I missed it. Carlo reached out a hand, wanting to touch her shoulder, wanting to offer some comfort, but he stopped midair. He didn't have the right. He had forfeited the right to comfort her when he gave her 10 minutes to leave his house. He stayed kneeling, letting her grief fill the silence, letting the sound of her weeping strip away the last of his pride. The moment shattered. A sharp buzz vibrated against Carlo's earpiece, followed by Frankie's voice, urgent and stripped of all protocol. Foss. 2 black SUVs just turned the corner. Russian plates. They're parking in front of the building. You have maybe 90 seconds before they breach the front door. Carlo's head snapped up. The father vanished. The penitent vanished. The kneeling man pushed himself off the floor with a lethal fluidity, his eyes shifting from sorrow to combat in the span of a heartbeat. He looked at Reese, who was still sobbing on the floor, unaware that the death sentence he had inadvertently signed was walking up the stairs. Reese, he said, his voice dropping into the command tone that brooked no argument. Get up. Now. Reese reacted first to the change. One moment, the man before her was a kneeling penitent, eyes wet with rain and regret. The next, he was stone. Carlo stood up, the movement so fluid and sharp it didn't look human, and the air in the room shifted from heavy sorrow to electric danger. Reese, grab your shoes, he ordered, his voice stripped of any softness. We're leaving. Reese stepped back, her back hitting the peeling wallpaper. The sudden switch terrified her more than the kneeling. I'm not going with you, she stammered, shaking her head. You fired me. You threw me out. I'm not getting in a car with you again. Carlo didn't have time to argue. He stepped into her personal space, looming over her, his eyes hard and dark. You don't have a choice. The men parking outside aren't police. They're Russian cartel, and they aren't here to talk. Reese froze, her breath hitching. I don't know any Russians, she whispered, her hands trembling. They know you, Carlo snapped, grabbing her sneakers from the floor and shoving them into her chest. They know you lived in my house. They think you know my codes. And they know about Beatrice. The name hit her like a physical slap. All the fight drained out of her legs. B, she choked out. They know about B? They know she's in Woodhull, room 412, Carlo said, repeating the intel Frankie had given him to drive the point home. If they don't find you here, they'll go there. Now move. Carlo shoved the window open. Rust flaked off under his grip, and the freezing rain lashed into the room. He pushed Reese toward it. Out. Fire escape. Now. She hesitated, looking at the dark, slick metal grid suspended 5 stories above the alley. Go. He grabbed her arm, not rough but firm, guiding her over the sill. She climbed out, jamming her feet into her sneakers as she stood on the vibrating metal grate. Carlo followed instantly, pulling the window down just as the apartment door behind them exploded inward with a deafening crash. Wood splintered. Heavy boots stomped on the concrete floor where Carlo had been kneeling seconds ago. Voices shouted in Russian, angry and sharp. Clear the room. Check the bath. Carlo put a finger to his lips, signaling absolute silence. They were exposed, clinging to a rusting skeleton of metal in a freezing downpour. He pointed down. They moved. Reese's hands shook so hard she almost missed the railing, her foot slipping on the wet iron. Carlo stayed right behind her, his body a shield, his hand hovering near her back to catch her if she fell, his eyes scanning the darkness below for threats. They reached the ground level, breathing hard. The alley was a river of mud and trash, shadowed by the looming buildings. The black Maserati was parked around the corner, but through the narrow gap between the bricks, Carlo saw two men in leather jackets standing by the front entrance, smoking, watching the street. The path to the car was cut off. "We have to run," Carlo whispered in her ear, his breath hot against the cold rain. "When I say go, you sprint for the car. You don't stop. You don't look back." Reese nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "Go." They bolted, feet splashing in puddles, creating a noise that cut through the storm. The men turned at the sound. "Hey!" one shouted, a hand reaching inside his jacket. Carlo didn't wait. He didn't have a gun, but he had momentum. He shoved Reese toward the passenger side and slammed his shoulder into the nearest Russian, sending him sprawling into the wet brick wall with a sickening crunch. The second man pulled a weapon. A muzzle flash lit up the rain. The crack of the gunshot echoed like thunder. The bullet shattered the brick inches from Carlo's head, sending dust into his eyes. "Get in!" Carlo roared, tearing the driver's door open. Reese scrambled inside, shrinking down. Carlo dove in after her. Another shot took out the side mirror, glass spraying across the hood. He slammed the car into gear. The tires screamed against the wet asphalt, finding grip, and the Maserati launched forward, fishtailing onto the street before straightening out and tearing away into the night. "My sister," Reese gasped, clutching the dashboard, her face pale as a sheet. "They're going to my sister." "No, they're not," Carlo said, his voice deadly calm as he wove through traffic at 80 miles an hour, running red lights without tapping the brakes. He hit the speed dial on the console. "Frankie. Woodhull. Now." "Already there, boss." Frankie's voice crackled back through the speakers. Teams Alpha and Bravo secured the perimeter. "We have 4 men on the 4th floor." They screeched to a halt in front of the emergency entrance 10 minutes later. Carlo didn't wait for a valet. He left the $100,000 car running at the curb and marched Reese through the sliding doors. Security guards stepped forward to stop them, saw Carlo's face, saw the blood on his cheek and the fury in his eyes, and stepped back. They took the elevator to the 4th floor in silence. When the doors opened, Reese stopped. The hallway wasn't a hospital corridor anymore. It was a fortress. 4 men in black suits stood outside room 412, hands clasped, eyes scanning. They saw Carlo and nodded. "She's sleeping, boss," one said. "No one has entered or exited." Reese ran past them, bursting into the room. She fell to her knees beside the bed where Beatrice lay sleeping, oblivious to the war that had just been fought for her life. And as Reese grabbed her sister's hand, checking her pulse, making sure she was real, she looked back at the doorway. Carlo stood there, soaked, muddy, bleeding, guarding the door. And for the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw a wall that nothing could break through. They didn't speak for 40 minutes. Not an awkward silence and not an angry one, but the silence of 2 people who had said everything that needed saying in a 5th-floor hallway and now needed time to breathe, to process, to let the truth settle. Rain hammered the windshield. The wipers swept back and forth. Streetlights streaked yellow lines. Reese sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window with her hand clenched around the photograph in her hoodie pocket. Carlo drove with his eyes fixed ahead and both hands on the wheel, and between them was the narrow space of the center console, the closest they had ever sat to each other, and also the first moment there was nothing false left between them. The Maserati stopped in front of the Todd Hill estate gates just before 11 at night. The rain had eased, but still fell steadily, like the city's long sigh. And when Carlo turned off the engine, they both sat in silence for a few seconds before he stepped out and walked around to open the door for Reese. Not out of gallantry, but out of the habit of scanning the surroundings before letting anyone out of the car, a habit he had drilled into himself after Catalina's death. Frankie stood at the front door and gave a single nod to confirm that security had been tightened, that 2 men were already at Woodhole, that B was safe, and that there were no unusual signs around the house, all conveyed in one motion, because Frankie was the kind of man who spoke more with gestures than words. Reese crossed the threshold of the mansion for the second time that day, but this time, she didn't carry the tentative caution of a new nanny reporting for work. She carried an old photograph in her hoodie pocket and legs sore from climbing 5 flights of stairs twice in one day. And the house greeted her with the sound she heard the moment the door opened. Crying. Arlo and Gio were still crying. Not screaming like earlier that afternoon, but making the exhausted whimpering sound Carlo had heard before Gio pulled himself up on the sofa. The kind of crying that had run out of tears, but not out of pain, echoing down from the nursery on the 2nd floor like a haunting loop in a house that was too big and too empty. Reese didn't wait for anyone to lead the way. She knew where the nursery was. She'd walked this path hundreds of times in 3 weeks. She took the stairs with quick, light steps Carlo had to lengthen his stride to match. And when she pushed the nursery door open, the soft yellow glow of the night light fell on 2 white cribs pushed close together. And in the left crib, Arlo and Gio were curled against each other, eyes swollen red, mouths still making that steady, exhausted sound. And Carlo stood behind Reese and realized the children had been crying for nearly 12 straight hours. From the moment she left until now, and no one in this house full of staff had been able to soothe them because they didn't need staff. They needed Reese. Gio heard the footsteps first. He lifted his head from his brother's shoulder, squinting red eyes in the dim light. And when he saw the figure in the doorway, he stopped crying. Not gradually, but abruptly, like someone hitting a mute button. And in that sudden silence, Carlo heard the rain outside the window with startling clarity. Because for the first time in 12 hours, the house no longer held the sound of a child crying. Gio grabbed the crib rail and pulled himself upright with hands Carlo now knew had been trained by Reese for 3 weeks. Then swung one leg over the rail, trying to climb out, his body wobbling dangerously. But before Carlo could move, Reese was already there, lifting Gio gently from the crib as he clutched her hoodie, both hands gripping the fabric, his face buried against her neck. And from his mouth came the sound that had driven Carlo to his knees in the living room earlier that day. Ree. He repeated it, not because he feared she'd vanish again, but because he needed to confirm she was real, that the person holding him was her and not a dream. And each time he said, Ree, his fingers tightened a little more in her shirt, as if swearing never to let go again. Arlo saw his brother being held and immediately stood up in his crib, arms reaching, and Reese lifted Arlo with her other arm. And now she stood in the center of the nursery with 2 14-month-old boys clinging to either side of her neck. And she sank to her knees, not because they were heavy, but because her knees couldn't take it anymore. She knelt on the nursery rug holding both children and cried silently, tears soaking into a hoodie already damp from the leaking ceiling in Bushwick and the rain outside, and the children stopped crying completely. Gio burying his face into her left shoulder, Arlo resting his head on her right, the 3 of them kneeling on the nursery floor in silence, with only their breathing slowing and the rain tapping at the window. Carlo stood in the doorway and didn't step inside because he knew this moment didn't belong to him. He'd lost the right to it the moment he'd barked Reese's name in the living room that morning. And now he stood outside like someone looking through glass into another person's warm home. But for the first time in 16 months since Catalina died, he felt warmth in this house. Not the warmth of an expensive heating system, but the warmth of 3 people holding each other on the floor. And he realized that warmth had been here all along for 3 weeks, brought in every day by yellow rubber gloves and a shouted hurricane warning, and he'd been too blind to feel it. The boys fell asleep on Reese's shoulders in under 10 minutes, exhausted from 12 hours of crying, and she laid them into the same crib because they refused to be separated. Then she stood and walked out of the room, passing Carlo in the doorway without looking at him, down the stairs and into the kitchen. And Carlo followed because he didn't know what else to do. She sat on the stool by the kitchen island, the same stool she'd sat on at 2 in the morning, calling beyond camera. And she looked at him with an expression that said she was here for B and not for him, and that he owed her an explanation. Carlo opened a cabinet and realized he didn't know where the coffee was kept. He'd lived in this house for 12 years and had never made his own coffee because someone had always done it for him. First Catalina, then Dolores, then some nanny, and now he stood in front of white oak cabinets opening drawers one by one looking for coffee like a man lost in his own home. And Reese watched him do it without helping and without laughing, just watching until he finally found the coffee in the 4th cabinet, brewed 2 cups with a French press he had to read the instructions on to use, set one in front of Reese, then sat across from her as steam rose between them in the kitchen near 3 in the morning. Reese took a sip and said she knew that technique because when she was 19, she'd volunteered at a center for disabled children in Hunts Point in the Bronx. 6 months, for shifts a week, unpaid, where they taught her physical therapy techniques for kids with delayed motor development, the only place in her life where someone had told her she was useful, that she was good at something. And when she saw Gio and saw he couldn't stand, she knew she could help. She paused, turning the coffee cup in her hands, and said the rubber gloves were a trick she'd learned there. The rubber surface creating friction to stabilize the baby's ankles without squeezing too hard. Gloves she'd bought at the dollar store on Knickerbocker for $1.99. $1.99. Carlo closed his eyes and thought about what he spent on security systems, armored cars, specialist doctors, and how the miracle that taught his son to walk had cost $1.99 and a girl who refused to give up. Carlo told Reese about Catalina, not like a boss reporting facts, but like a husband who still remembered his wife's perfume, telling her the car bomb had been meant for him. That Catalina had woken early that morning wanting to buy flowers for the living room, but her car was out of gas, so she took the keys to his Mercedes instead. That she kissed him at the door and said she'd be back in 30 minutes. And that those 30 minutes never ended because 17 minutes later, his phone rang. And Frankie said 2 words he'd never forget. She died because her car was out of gas, Carlo said, his voice flat while his hand clenched the coffee cup until his knuckles went white. A coincidence he lived with every day. They sat in silence for a long time after that. No touching, no romantic glances, just 2 damaged people sitting across a marble island in a kitchen at 3 in the morning, drinking coffee a mafia boss had made for the first time himself, listening to each other in a way neither of them was used to being listened to, without judgment, without interruption, without comparing whose pain was greater. Then Reese set her cup down and spoke calmly and clearly like someone reading contract terms rather than asking for mercy, saying that if she stayed, she had 3 conditions. No uniform because she'd wear what she chose. No one entering the room while she worked with the children. Not him, not guards. No one because her methods looked crazy, but they worked. And she needed the boys focused. And third, she needed to know his coming and going schedule, not out of curiosity about his work, but because the children needed to know when their father was home. Carlo nodded to all 3 conditions without a second of hesitation. Because compared to what he'd just seen, compared to Joe's steps and the sound of Ree, those conditions were cheaper than anything he'd ever paid in his life. Then he added one more sentence that had nothing to do with contracts or power. Just a clumsy father trying to learn how to care. Put socks on the boys, the wooden floor's cold. Carlo slept for less than 2 hours that night, not because he couldn't sleep, but because he sat in the security room with Frankie reviewing the entire newly installed camera system until he was certain there wasn't a single blind spot left in the house. And when he finally drifted off on the sofa in his office, it was nearly 5 in the morning. And when the doorbell woke him at 8:15, sunlight was already flooding through the windows, and it took him a few seconds to remember where he was and why he was sleeping on a sofa instead of in his bed. Frankie opened the front door and his voice carried down the hall, low and controlled. The voice of a man positioning himself between his boss and something unwelcome. And Carlo heard another voice, unfamiliar, with a quality he recognized instantly because he'd heard it many times in his life, a police voice. He stood, ran a hand through his hair, fastened the button of a vest wrinkled from sleeping in it, and stepped into the hall. Two people stood at the front door. A uniformed New York City police officer with a gleaming badge on his chest and a notebook already open in his hand. Beside him, a younger female officer half a step back with her hand resting near her hip out of habit. Both of them looking into the house with eyes Carlo knew well. The eyes of people cataloging details for a report. "Mr. Benedetti," the male officer asked, polite but not warm, professional. "We received a complaint from a Dolores Moreno. She alleges that an employee in your home named Reese Holloway assaulted her and stole personal property. She has medical documentation and a list of missing items valued at," the officer glanced down at his notebook, "about $23,000. We need to speak with Miss Holloway." Carlo wasn't surprised. He'd known Dolores would strike back from the moment he'd heard her screaming curses at Reese as she was escorted out the previous afternoon. Because when people were cornered, they only had two responses, accept or attack. And Dolores wasn't the type to accept anything. She was the kind of woman who could sell him to the people who killed his wife for 4 months and still sleep soundly at night. The kind who didn't know how to accept, only how to retaliate. And the weapon she'd chosen was so perfectly aimed Carlo almost admired it if he hadn't been furious. A false police report aimed at the weakest target. At Reese, a girl without a lawyer, without bail money, without family protection, a girl who, if arrested on the word of a 62-year-old woman with fabricated medical papers, would lose everything. Her job, her chance to earn money for B's treatment, her freedom, and Dolores knew all of that because she lived in this house long enough to know Reese had nothing except this job. Reese appeared at the top of the stairs, holding Gio. She froze when she saw the uniforms. Carlo saw the blood drain from her face, saw her grip on the banister tighten until her knuckles were white. It wasn't the reaction of a guilty person. It was the reaction of someone who had been chewed up by the system since she was 7 years old. Someone who knew that when the police came, they didn't come to help girls like her. They came to take her away, to put her in a car, to drive her to a new home she didn't want or a cell she didn't deserve. The foster care trauma flashed in her eyes, raw and terrifying. She took a step back, looking like she might run, might hide, might crumble right there on the landing. And seeing that fear, seeing the way she looked at the officers as if they were executioners, lit a cold fire in Carlo's chest. He didn't look at Reese. He stepped forward, placing his body physically between the officers and the stairs, blocking their view of her completely. "Officer, I appreciate you doing your job by the book," Carlo said in a calm tone that bordered on friendly. And that calm was dangerous in a completely different way from the calm of an underground meeting room. Dangerous because it was legal. But before you proceed any further, I think you should be aware of a few facts. First, Dolores Moreno was terminated by me yesterday afternoon for theft. Not theft from Miss Holloway, but theft of my late wife's property, jewelry, multiple items, repeatedly, all of it recorded by a 16-channel security camera system running 24/7. Carlo pulled a USB drive from his inner jacket pocket, already prepared by Frankie the night before because Frankie thought 3 steps ahead just like his boss. "This is a copy of the footage. You're welcome to review it. It shows Mrs. Moreno opening my wife's jewelry cabinet with a spare key, taking items and handing them to a man outside the side gate of this house, multiple times over several weeks." The officer looked at the USB, looked up at Carlo's face, and Carlo noticed the pen in the officer's hand had stopped moving. Second, Carlo continued, his voice still perfectly even and courteous. "During our camera review, We discovered that Mrs. Moreno has been in frequent contact with individuals my security team has identified as belonging to a foreign criminal organization. I haven't forwarded this information to any agency yet because I wanted to handle matters internally first. But if Mrs. Moreno continues to use the legal system to harass my employee with false reports, I will forward all evidence to the FBI. And at that point, her $23,000 assault complaint will become the smallest problem in her life because contact with a foreign criminal organization falls under federal jurisdiction, not the New York Police Department, and the penalties for that are considerably more severe than petty theft or assault. Carlo delivered the final sentence with a mild smile, the kind he used when signing contracts rather than passing judgment. And that distinction mattered because it told the officer he wasn't threatening. He was informing, and the information was enough to turn the complainant into a suspect if necessary. The officer looked at the USB, looked at his female partner, looked back at Carlo, then slowly closed his notebook. "We'll review this information and follow up if needed, Mr. Benedetti." His tone had changed. No longer the voice of an officer pursuing an assault case, but of someone who'd realized he'd stepped into something far larger than a routine complaint and wanted a clean exit. "Have a good day." The two officers turned, walked down the steps, got into their patrol car, and drove away. Carlo stood at the door watching the police car disappear down Todd Hill, then closed the door, leaned his back against the heavy wood, and exhaled deeply. He was tired. Not tired from dealing with the police. That was easy, but tired because he knew Dolores wouldn't stop here. She'd try another route, and he had to block every path before she could take it. When he opened his eyes and turned back into the house, he saw Reese. She stood at the living room doorway with Gio in her arms, the baby sucking his thumb and resting his head against her shoulder, eyes half closed after breakfast, and Reese looked at Carlo with an expression it took him a few seconds to realize he couldn't decode. It wasn't gratitude, because gratitude sounded small and dependent. And Reese wasn't small or dependent. It wasn't fear because she'd been done with fear for a long time. It wasn't admiration because she didn't admire power. It was something else. Something Carlo had never seen on anyone's face when they looked at him. And it took him the rest of that day to understand what it was. It was the look of someone seeing him for the first time. Not as Benedetti, the boss, not as the powerful man the entire underworld bowed to, not as the man who'd barked her out of his house, but simply as a tired father leaning against his own front door at 8 in the morning after almost no sleep, trying to keep the roof from collapsing on the people inside it. Petrov made his move on the second day after Dolores was dismissed. A black SUV with tinted windows parked across the street from the Todd Hill estate gate. Not moving, not turning off its engine, just sitting there from morning until night like a beast scenting its prey before the strike. Frankie spotted it first through the outer gate cameras, recorded the license plate, and traced it to a rental under a shell company in Brighton Beach. Same network, same methods. On the second day, the SUV returned, this time with a man stepping out onto the sidewalk and openly raising his phone to photograph the house facade, the gate, the cameras, the guard positions. No attempt to hide, no fear of being seen because Petrov wanted Carlo to know he was watching. That was how he played. He didn't attack first. He forced his opponent to fear first, and only then did he strike. On the third day, Frankie reported more. Petrov's people were asking around at 2 neighborhood restaurants about the schedule of vehicles entering and leaving the estate, and a strange man tried to strike up a conversation with the regular grocery delivery worker for the Benedetti house. Petrov was drawing a map, and Carlo knew that once the map was complete, the action would come. And Petrov's actions were never gentle because 16 months ago, he'd proven that with a bomb under a car. Carlo convened a meeting in the underground room beneath the Italian restaurant on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx, where his father and grandfather had once sat at the head of the table, where every life or death decision of the Benedetti family had been made for 4 generations. For allied bosses sat around the table, each representing a family controlling a portion of the East Coast underworld. And Carlo stood at the head and said something no one in that room expected. He didn't talk about territory. He didn't talk about money. He didn't talk about revenge. He talked about his children. He said Petrov was threatening his family's safety, that he'd bought someone inside his house for 4 months, that he was watching the house where his children slept every night, and he offered the Benedetti favor. The Benedetti favor was the strongest currency in the underworld. Not cash, but a promise that the Benedetti family would owe an unlimited favor, callable at any time for anything. And in 4 generations, that promise had never been broken. In return, he needed the 4 families to simultaneously cut all business ties with Petrov. Cut supply, shut ports, close routes, turn his territory into an island no one wanted to trade with. No bloodshed, no guns, no bonds, just isolation. The 4 bosses looked at one another because this was the first time Carlo Benedetti, famous for fast and decisive solutions, had chosen a non-violent option. And one of them asked why. Carlo was silent for a moment, and in his mind echoed Reese's voice in the kitchen at 3 in the morning 2 nights earlier when she'd said something he couldn't refute. Violence only makes more orphans. He didn't repeat that sentence to the 4 bosses because they wouldn't understand. But he said, "My children already lost their mother to violence. I won't let them lose anyone else." 4 nods went around the table. The Benedetti favor was accepted. Over the next 2 weeks, Petrov lost his cocaine supply from the family controlling the port of Newark, lost access to 3 transport routes through Philadelphia family territory, lost 2 money laundering partners in Atlantic City, and lost protection contracts in 3 commercial districts in Brooklyn that the Allied families quietly absorbed without a single shot fired. The black SUV disappeared from Todd Hill on the 10th day. Petrov withdrew, not because he feared Carlo, but because he ran out of money to fight. And in the underworld, losing money was more dangerous than losing a life, because a life was lost once, but money was lost every day. The night Carlo received word of Petrov's retreat, he came home late, near midnight, exhausted, but lighter than any night in 16 months. He stepped into the nursery and stopped at the doorway. Reese was asleep in the rocking chair beside the crib. Gio curled on her chest, his head against her shoulder, one small hand still gripping the fabric of her shirt even in sleep. Arlo lay in the nearest crib, wrapped in his blanket up to his chin. His face turned toward the rocking chair, as if even asleep he needed to know Reese was there. Carlo removed his jacket, stepped softly to the chair, and draped it over Reese's shoulders, careful not to touch her, careful not to wake Gio. Then he sat down on the wooden floor beside the chair, leaned his back against the wall, and closed his eyes. He fell asleep right there on the nursery floor. The first time in 16 months he'd slept in the same room as his children, and he slept without dreams, the deepest sleep since the night before Catalina died. The next morning he woke before Reese, his neck stiff from sleeping against the wall. And he went downstairs and made coffee himself for the second time in his life. This time without searching for the coffee because he remembered it was in the 4th cabinet. When Reese came into the kitchen with Gio on her hip and Arlo clinging to her leg, Carlo placed an envelope in front of her. Inside was a new employment contract. Salary triple the previous amount. Comprehensive health insurance including immediate family members. Reese opened it, read, and nodded. No effusive thanks, just a nod. Because she understood it was a fair agreement, not charity. Then Carlo continued, "There's one more thing. Leah's been moved to the top of the UNO's waiting list. I found a compatible kidney donor through a private medical network. The surgeon is the head of transplant surgery at Mount Sinai. Surgery is scheduled for next Monday. I'm covering everything." Reese didn't react immediately. She set the envelope down, looked at Carlo, and he saw her lips move without sound, her throat locking as she tried to speak. And then the tears came. Not the restrained crying of 2 in the morning, or the exhausted sobbing in Bushwick, but the kind that bursts from the deepest place inside someone who's carried too much for too long, and suddenly hears someone say, "Let me carry it with you." She cried, and Gio on her hip watched her cry, then lifted his tiny hand and patted her cheek the way she always patted his back when he cried. "Why?" Reese asked, her voice breaking. Carlo looked at Gio, patting her cheek, then back at her. "You taught my son to walk when I'd given up. Saving your sister is the least I can do." Reese reached out, not to hug, not to shake hands. She took his hand resting on the table and held it tight, her fingers closing around his, and it was the first time they touched. Not a romantic or dramatic touch, just one person holding another's hand because there were no words heavy enough for the moment, so the body had to speak instead. Carlo didn't pull away. He let her hold on and added one last sentence. Soft, almost a whisper. "And call me Carlo. Just Carlo." 6 months later, snow falls outside the Todd Hill estate, whitening the tiled roof, whitening the iron fence, whitening the road where Petrov's black SUV once sat for 3 days, and where now only small children's footprints mark the thin snow because every morning Reese takes the kids outside for 10 minutes to look at the flakes before breakfast. Inside the house, the living room has transformed so completely that if Catalina walked in, she wouldn't recognize it, though she might smile. The Italian leather sofa she chose still sits in the same place, but it's now buried under colorful quilts in blue, red, yellow, and purple, blankets Reese bought at a discount store so cheap that Carlo shook his head and laughed when he saw the receipt. The corner that once held a $20,000 abstract sculpture is now a massive pillow fortress that Arlo and Gio build every morning, destroy every afternoon, then rebuild the next day. And Carlo put the sculpture into storage after Gio nearly pulled it down once, deciding that anything heavier than a pillow was banished from the living room. The Persian rug is still there, still centered on the floor, but it's no longer a sacred artifact. It's a stage, a battlefield, a kingdom where Arlo declares himself king and Gio is the roaring monster. This afternoon, in the middle of the season's first snowfall, Carlo Benedetti lies on his back on that rug, not in a suit or Italian leather shoes, but in worn knee-faded jeans and an old T-shirt, a sock puppet on his hand with button eyes and a red stitched mouth that Reese sewed from old socks. He raises it to the ceiling and shouts in a hoarse, dramatic voice, "Attention citizens of Rugtown." The tickle monster approaches. No one is safe. 2 seconds of silence, then 2 tiny creatures burst from behind the sofa like bullets. Arlo charging with a battle cry only he understands, and Gio, the child Dr. Whitfield once said had severe motor delays, the child the world claimed would almost never stand on his own, runs the fastest, faster than his brother. Legs that once trembled on Reese's stomach now pounding the wooden floor with confidence as he launches himself onto Carlo's stomach, his knees slamming into Carlo's ribs hard enough to hurt, but Carlo laughs so loudly the whole house seems to shake. Arlo jumps on next, both kids pinning him down, tickling his neck, his sides, his stomach, and Carlo pretends to writhe and beg for mercy in the same voice he once used to pass judgment on traitors, now pleading before 2 20-month-old children. "Help, Reese. They're devouring me. I'm done for." Reese stands in the kitchen doorway, shoulder against the wall, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, watching with a smile she didn't think she'd be able to wear 6 months ago. She's in jeans and a sweater, no uniform, no yellow rubber gloves. Those gloves now rest in a nursery drawer, their job finished because Gio runs so fast now she has to chase him instead of catching him. Her role changed long ago without any formal announcement, nothing written in any contract, yet everyone in the house knows it. Frankie knows, the kids know, Carlo knows that Reese is no longer an invisible employee, but an ally, a partner, the person Carlo consults before making any decision involving the children. The person the kids run to when they're happy and when they're hurt. The woman who walked into a house drowning in darkness and refused to leave until it filled with light. Carlo yells from the floor as the kids sit on his chest, laughing. "Reese, this is a direct order. Save me." She laughs, takes a sip of tea, sets the mug down, and says calmly, "Sorry, Carlo." In the jungle of the living room, only the strong survive. Then she dives in. She throws herself into the chaos on the Persian rug, tickling Arlo, bracing Carlo's legs to keep him pinned, Gio climbing onto her back, laughing until he hiccups. And the four of them roll across the expensive rug Catalina bought on her last trip, rolling and laughing, shouts mixing with breathless gasps. No difference between Mafia boss and foster care survivor. No difference between $1,000 shoes and bare feet. No difference between Benedetti blood and Holloway blood. Just four people rolling on a living room floor on a snowy afternoon. A strange family stitched together from loss and assembled by time spent side by side. Thee's kidney transplant was successful 3 months earlier at Mount Sinai, and she's recovering well in a new Brooklyn apartment Carlo rented near the hospital for follow-ups. Every Sunday, Reese brings the kids to visit B. Gio calls her B, and Arlo cries every time they have to leave. Dolores never appears again. Petrov shrinks his territory back to Brighton Beach and never crosses the line. The security cameras still run 24 hours a day, but what they record now isn't frightening silence, it's laughter. If you pulled the camera back through the living room window that afternoon, you'd see the Todd Hill house glowing against the white winter night, the loudest on the block, the warmest on the block, and the richest on the block. Not rich because of money locked in a basement safe or power stretching across the East Coast, but rich because of what Carlo Benedetti took 38 years to understand. That a man's true wealth isn't measured by how many people bow when he enters a room, but by how many times his children run toward him when he walks through the door. Carlo looks at Reese across the tangled pile of limbs and blankets, his eyes softening, and he realizes that 6 months ago he oiled the hinges of his front door to catch a traitor, but instead, he caught a miracle. This story reminds us that sometimes the truest love comes from the least expected places, from cheap rubber gloves, from a woman with no degree and no family, but a heart larger than any empire. And that our greatest mistake isn't making mistakes, but refusing to kneel and admit them. Every one of us has judged someone too quickly, trusted the wrong person, and doubted the right one. And Carlo and Reese's story is a reminder that it's never too late to make things right if we're brave enough to face the truth. Thank you for listening to this story on Sunni romance. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share so you can hear more meaningful stories like this every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever judged someone too soon and later realized you are wrong? Have you ever met someone small in stature but carrying an immense love inside them? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We truly want to hear what's in your hearts, because every story you share becomes the inspiration that helps us keep bringing content that reaches the soul day after day. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and to always be surrounded by people who truly love you. Goodbye and see you in the next video.